Welcome to California Highways Route by Route. This podcast explores everything about the numbered highways in California, from Route 1 along the coast to US 395 along the Sierras, from Route 8 in the south to Route 139 in the north.
Brought to you by the California Highways webpage and Gribble Nation.
I'm Daniel Fagan. I maintain the California Highways webpage.
I'm Tom Fear. I'm one of 4 admins on Gribble Nation.
This is episode 1.09, Highway Numbering, Interstate Highways. Last time on California Highways Route by Route, we continued our exploration of highway numbering in California. This started in episode 1.07, where we explored state highway numbering and post miles and all that good stuff. Last episode, we discussed the U.S. highway system, the history of the system, the original plan for U.S. highway numbers, the original U.S. highways in the state, and the remaining U.S. highways in California.
In this episode, we will also look at the interstate highways, the history of the interstate system, California's interstate system, the types of interstates and the chronology, how the interstates are numbered. In the road community, this has been the subject of many memes, a lot of conjecture, and really a lot of misunderstanding, I've found.
I just want to add, the reference to the memes is that there's this YouTube video that's been going around where everyone is astonished to see how interstate highways are numbering. You've seen that one?
I have. Right? My brother-in-law sent it to me. He's like, oh, is this true? Like, this is an actual grid? I'm like, yeah. Yeah, it is.
So that's really what this episode will be talking about, among other things.
This is the 3rd episode of a 4-part miniseries exploring that issue. In the first episode, we explored state highways, which are the green highway spade shields. In the second episode, we explored the U.S. routes, how they are numbered, and how they got those numbers. This episode will look at how the interstates are numbered. This will include the different types of interstates and interstate miles. Lastly, in episode 1.10, we'll look at the county sign route system.
I like to characterize this episode as everything you want to know about numbers and interstate highways, but we're sort of afraid to ask. Those of you who are old enough will get the reference to that name. So let's talk about the inadequacies of the U.S. highway system. We explored that system in the last episode. But it really was an inadequate system. It was a system of federal aid highways, not a national highway system. It was limited to 7% of the roads in the state. 3/7 of those roads must be, as they said, interstate in character, whatever that meant. 60% of the federal aid funds could be used on those roads, and it was typically a network built from existing state highways. There were no national standards for roads in the network. Routes could range from early dirt roads, and there were some segments of US 466 that were dirt, over near San Luis Obispo in that area, to early freeways. US 66 is a good example of that. The roads were often inadequate for major transcontinental movement and goods movement. And the federal funding for the network was low. Remember the ABC formula from the previous episodes?
Leading up to the interstate system, in 1919, Eisenhower participates in a transcontinental convoy from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. There's loads of mechanical problems due to bad roads. This is kind of the genesis of the good roads movement. It took 62 days to cross the country. To a modern sense, that's pretty unfathomable. Like when I moved across the country several times in the last 2 decades, it really only took me tops 8 days because I was really kind of loafing it. I really could have gotten there 2, 3, 4 days if I really tried to. That just kind of illustrates how poor a condition roads were in the early 20th century. May 1935, the first section of the Autobahn system opens. This is a great example of modern road building. Poor economic planning, built in advance of traffic needs, bypassed the cities. Eisenhower sees the Autobahns in Europe during World War II. In the U.S., statewide traffic surveys documented needs in each state. A combined report, Toll Roads and Free Roads, in 1939 became the basis of FDR's master plan for a system of interregional highways.
Now, FDR believed that construction of a network of toll superhighways would provide more jobs for people out of work. And note what FDR was looking for, toll roads. He thought 3 east-west and 3 north-south routes would be sufficient. That's all you needed. 3 going across the country, 3 going up and down. A 1939 report asserted that a network of toll highways would not work, as most routes would not be self-supporting with toll. They recommended an approximate 26,700-mile network that followed existing roads. For routes that would have traffic greater than 2,000 vehicles a day, they wanted more than 2 lanes with limited access. They also wanted radial routes around cities as well as inner beltways. A 1943 follow-up report recommended a network of 40,000 miles.
1944 Interstate Highway Acts. The interstate system created by the 1944 Federal Highway Aid Act. This authorized 40,000 miles. Routes selected jointly between state departments and the Bureau of Public Roads. The BPR is what the acronym for that is. Initial designation approved on August 7th, 1947, with about 38,000 miles. The remaining approximately 2,300 miles of urban loop and distributing routes to be defined later. Did not provide priority, authorize federal funding, commit federal construction, nor increase federal share of funding. The total mileage in California was a little bit under 2,000 miles. The initial standards in 1945 did not call for uniform design. Most segments would have to be at least 4 lanes, full control of access. There were 2-lane segments with limited access control. Some at-grade crossings were permitted with low traffic. So what's interesting, I always think about the early concept of the interstate system, it really resembles more like the autopista system that you would see in Mexico than you would see with a modern interstate system.
Having not driven the roads in Mexico, I'm not familiar with that system.
Yeah, there's a lot of really rural at-grade crossings. One that I'm very familiar with our family that we visited in Jalisco, 54D, there's a whole bunch of them that are used for like ranching roads and everything. So basically you just drive from like a dirt road onto the autopista, and sometimes you could use it as a bypass for the tolls.
As we got into the early 1950s, the states were hesitant to commit to this. They didn't want to divert funds from local needs. Some states felt the standards were too high, and other states authorized toll roads due to low federal funding. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1952 authorized $25 million on a 50-50 matching basis, but even there, that amount was inadequate. In 1954, Eisenhower turned his attention to highways. A 1954 bill authorized $175 million, which is $150 million more than that first bill in 52, and that was on a 60-40 matching. Eisenhower pushed for a $50 billion program over 10 years based on his 1919 experience. Arguments ensued on how to pay for this. Did you want to do gas taxes? Did you want to do bonds? And Al Gore Sr. proposed a $10 billion bill through 1961 with a 75-25 split, and that was approved by the Senate in 1955. Also in 1955, states were requested to submit additions for urban areas. Remember, there was an additional, 2,300 miles that had been unallocated. This was using up those miles, something like that. These were approved in September 1955, and California's total allocation after that was 2,135 miles.
That leads us to the 1956 Federal Highway Act. The end result was $24.8 billion over 13 years with a 90-10 split on funding. So 90% was coming from the federal government. Financed on a pay-as-you-go basis, called for a uniform design of standards to accommodate traffic forecasted by 1975. The Bureau of Public Roads worked with AASHTO to develop minimum standards that would ensure uniformity of design, full access control, and elimination of highways at railroad highway grade crossings. Some exceptions were made for really low traffic areas. A real prime example of that is some ranching roads in Texas. I knew of one when I lived in Phoenix on I-17 on the northbound lanes. Access to limited interchanges, no commercial establishments in the right of way. Authorized an additional 1,000 miles, and none of that went to California. So now we're up to 41,000 miles. Number is key for understanding what we call chargeable interstates. A chargeable interstate counts against the total miles authorized by the federal funding. Non-chargeable interstates are signed as interstates, but don't count against the allocated mileage. So they're not being financed by the federal government with a 90% share.
They may have been financed, I'll note, through the U.S. highway approach, which had a different funding percentage, but they don't get the interstate 90-10 split. So in 1957, the first formal mileage estimate was done, and they discovered of their intended 41,000-mile system, they were 1,102 miles short. And this gave California more routes. In particular, it gave us the Beltline bypass north of Sacramento, which was then to be numbered Route 880 and is now I-80, And they give us the San Diego Beltline, this 805. This brought California to 2,177 miles.
There were some adjustments in 1965 when the San Francisco Freeway Revolt occurred. This resulted in reducing the San Francisco's mileage by 8.7 miles. The deletion of the original Route 105 and Route 110 in downtown Los Angeles redistributed another 2 miles. Route 280 and Route 680 relocated from the Route 17 which became Interstate 880. California's total was now 2,165 miles. Additionally, in 1966, legislation required all parts to be at least 4 lanes with no at-grade intersections.
There were further adjustments in 1968. In particular, the Century Freeway was added with 10 miles from San Francisco and 7 miles of what are called Howard Kramer miles, was the guy who put in the amendment, which was substitution from another segment. The Federal Aid Highway Act added another 1,500 miles, bringing the total chargeable miles to 42,500. California got 106 miles of that, though. There was the extension of I-15 from I-10 to I-8. Note that the portion below I-8, not chargeable interstate. The addition of I-605 between I-10 and 210. The addition of I-380. And this brought us now in California to 2,288 chargeable miles of interstate.
And there were several adjustments after that. In 1972, Interstate 15's alignment shifted west of Corona and Narco, and the new mileage was 2,294 miles. In 1976, I-980 was added, so this brought this up to 2,295 miles. In 1978, Interstate 180 was added. This became an extension of Interstate 580. This added a section west of Interstate 80 to the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge. So this brought California's total mileage up to 2,301. The mileage correction near Lake Elsinore shortened it to an even 2,300 miles. Also during 1978, Interstate 110 was added between Route 47 and Interstate 10. This is the Harbor Freeway. This brought it up to 2,320 miles. 1980, the Route 51 segment of former Interstate 80, this is the original corridor of Interstate 80 in Sacramento, was removed. This created Interstate 305, which is not signed, but it does exist on the FHWA's books. This is US 50, the extension of US 50 to Interstate 80. It's technically an interstate. I-880 was renumbered as Interstate 80 in Sacramento. This brought the mileage up to 2,313 miles. In 1981, Interstate 280 between 6th Street and the Oakland Bay Bridge was removed. This brought the total back down to 2,311 miles.
And just a few notes on these changes. The addition in 1978 of I-180, which later became I-580, created the unique situation that you had an overall north-south route that became east-west, or I had that backwards. You had an overall east-west route that now became north-south. So I-580 at that point was going north from Oakland to San Rafael. At the same time, it was being carried on Interstate 80, which was going west or south from Sacramento to San Francisco. And therefore, you have signs in that segment of North 580, South 80 on the exact same road. And that's always amusing to people.
Yeah. The wrong way concurrency is what they call that. That's a very famous item on a lot of AA Roads threads.
And the other thing that is worth noting here is what happened in 1980, where the former segment of I-80, and this is the old Route 99 West segment from basically where US 50 and Route 99 come together to up near I always forget the name of the town. It's Roseville. Okay, so the segment from the US 50-99 connection up to Roseville was removed from the interstate system because it actually didn't meet interstate standards, and I-80 was rerouted along what was to be the bypass, 880. And that gave us some extra miles, but that was a whole big mess in Sacramento that I know we're not going to be getting to for a while, so it's worth highlighting here.
It's interesting, though, because that's technically how you can get around the number duplication with Interstate 80 business, because Interstate 80 business, what's signed as it, is technically US 50 and Route 51 legislatively.
Right. Now, this new system of roads led to a new sign, okay? Interstate signage started after the 1956 Act, and it was a new shield visibly distinct from the U.S. highway shields. In some ways, it's like going from black and white television to color television, because we had a red, white, and blue design unveiled in 1957, and it was a combination of designs that was submitted by Missouri and Texas. The basic route numbering is similar to U.S. highway. East-west routes are even, north-south routes are odd, major routes end in 0 or 5. The positioning of the routes is opposite the U.S. highway. So whereas the U.S. highways had the lowest numbers in the north and the east, the interstates have the highest numbers in the north and the east. This also led to the fact that Interstate 50 and Interstate 60 were not assigned so that they didn't conflict with the U.S. highways that would have been in the exact same places.
Continuing on with interstate signage, 3-digit routes take a different approach. The first digit odd, spur route to an area different from its parent route. The first digit even is a loop route, and it connects back to its parent or is an offshoot. There's some numbering anomalies in the interstate system, some very famous ones. You have some that are odd because they were due to legislative fiascos, like I-99, which is out of grid. It's west of I-95. Some due to a lack of numbers available, which is like I-238, the very famous one in California. We hit on Interstate 180 a couple minutes ago. The reason why that corridor could not be numbered as such is because California State Route 180 is a major highway corridor in the Fresno area, and today a major freeway corridor. At the time, all the X80 routes in California were used up, which is how we got I-238. Some were due to withdrawal of a route without concurrent renumbering of a route linked to it. Imagine impacts related to the withdrawal of the original I-80 in Sacramento. California was big on renumbering things, which is really kind of the whole thing that spurred the 1964 state highway renumbering. Some states really weren't. When I was in Arizona, they didn't really seem to really care too much about renumbering anything to make room for interstates or make the numberings related to state routes make sense.
And I'll just mention on I-238, because there was an article that just came out this week that talked about how using maps actually helps prevent Alzheimer's or helps your memory versus being dependent on a GPS system. So go use your map. One of the reasons they used I-238 and they made it an interstate was because at the time, truck drivers could not depend on GPS. There was no GPS, yet they could depend on interstate routes as having the appropriate height and weight restrictions for trucks. And they wanted to discourage trucks from taking I-580 through Oakland, which was prohibited from truck traffic. And so by numbering 238 as an interstate, they were telling truckers, hey, you've got the continuity of suitable, safe road to take you over to the bay without having to cut over on 580. You weren't on some lower class state route. And that's one of the reasons they renumbered it and didn't worry about, oh yeah, this numbering doesn't fit the system. So let's now talk about control cities. If you follow road forums, you'll see lots of people are up in arms about control cities, and they refer to a lot of things as control cities when they're really not controlled cities. You see this when people complain about things like, oh, Route 91 having a, quote, controlled city of beach cities. Or they complain about I-605 talking about through traffic.
Or other desert cities.
Right.
On I-10.
Controlled cities refer to major destinations shown on an interstate signage. And per the manual on uniform traffic control devices, the direction of a freeway in major destinations or controlled cities shall be clearly identified through the use of appropriate destination legends. Successive freeway guide signs shall provide continuity in these destination names and consistency with available map information. At any decision point, a given destination shall be indicated by way of only one route. So you shouldn't get to a point where two interstates come together and both directions say, all right, Los Angeles. They are required to be used at interchanges, separation points of overlapping freeway routes, on directional signs, on intersecting routes, on pull-through signs, and on the bottom line of post-interchange distance signs. Those are those 3 mileage signs. Now, for major interstates, control cities are defined. So for I-5 northbound, the control cities are in order: San Diego, Santa Ana, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Sacramento, Redding, Mount Shasta City, Weed, Wairika, and Ashland, Oregon. I-5 southbound, invert these a little: Ashland, Oregon, Wairika, Weed, Mount Shasta City, Redding, Sacramento, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Santa Ana, San Diego. I-8 has San Diego, El Centro, and Yuma, Arizona. I-10 has Santa Monica, Los Angeles, San Bernardino, Riverside, Indio, Blythe, and Phoenix. I-15 has San Diego, Riverside, San Bernardino, Los Angeles, Barstow, and Las Vegas. I-40 has Barstow, Needles, and Kingman. And I-80 has San Francisco, Sacramento, and Reno. Continuous signing is nationally guaranteed for a control city. Now, loops and spurs have forward directions for intermediate points, but then defer to their major route cities. Note that control cities only apply to interstate highways. State and U.S. routes don't have control cities. There are unpublished lists of official forward directions. I know I've seen one show up either on the Freeways of LA forum or it was posted to AA Roads. And these are often the ultimate destinations or the names of cities reachable with the next interstate connection, which is why sometimes you'll see things that, yeah, this route doesn't go there, but it's still listed as a control city or as a forward direction. Do you want to add anything from your observations in this area, Tom?
I think people probably make a little too big of a thing on some of the ones we've talked about, like through traffic or beach cities. Like you said, that's not really the true control city that they're looking for. But in the road community world, it seems to be a sore subject, and I never really personally have understood why. But what's interesting I've noticed is through looking through AASHTO documents is that the U.S. routes also have control cities, but they're not widely signed like they are on the interstates, but they do have control cities which are officially listed on a log like the interstates are.
Do you recall what some of them are?
Usually where I've researched most of this is the endpoint city. So like when I did the research on the endpoint history of US 66 in Los Angeles, that was really the key element, was that Los Angeles was the control city endpoint. So that was the western end.
As opposed to, say, Santa Monica.
Yes. So when Santa Monica paid Los Angeles City Council to have US 66 signed into Santa Monica, AASHTO took exception to this because Santa Monica was never approved to be the end control city for US 66.
So now we're going to talk about California's chargeable interstates. These are the interstates, remember, that count against the miles that were authorized in law for the interstate system. So we'll go through these in order, and then we're going to go through this a couple of times, in fact. I-5, lowest numbered route, 797 miles from Mexico to Oregon. Initial allocation was in June 1945 via Route 99. And that was shifted in May of 1957 through what is called the West Side Freeway relocation to a route called the Westerly routing that pretty much goes through nowhere except maybe King City and Harris Ranch up to Sacramento, which is why truckers like it. I-8, 170 miles from I-5 to Arizona near Yuma. Note that the portion that is west of I-5 was not originally part of I-8. It was submitted in June 1954. I-10, 240.9 miles via Santa Monica to I-5 via Arizona near Blythe. June 27th, 1945, you had the I-5 to Arizona section, and then they added in September 1955 Santa Monica to I-5. That was subsuming old Route 26, which at one point I think it had even been Route 10 before it became 26, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, the Santa Monica Freeway was originally Route 26.
Right, but wasn't it 10 for a little bit before it was 26? Or am I confusing that with Route 40? No, Route 42 was Route 10, the original state Route 10. Okay. Then you had I-15, 287.3 miles from I-8 to Nevada. That started out in June 1945 with the segment from I-10 to Nevada. December 1968 gave you I-8 to I-10, and then we had some adjustments. In 1972, there was an adjustment near Corona and Norco, as well as from Temecula to Devore. There were some state highways in those areas because the route used to go along more the 395 routing. And in 1978, in July, there was a mileage correction near Lake Elsinore.
Continuing with California's chargeable interstates, Interstate 40, 154.6 miles, I-15 near Barstow to Arizona near Needles, approved on June 27, 1945. Interstate 80, 202.2 miles, First Street, San Francisco to Nevada, approved on June 27, 1945, San Francisco to the Nevada state line. July 1958, Sacramento Belt Route was originally charged as Interstate 80. During May 1980, the withdrawal of the original Interstate 80 in Sacramento. I-880, the original one, was renumbered as Interstate 80. The original I-80 between I-80 and US 50 became unsigned Route 51.
Some more chargeable interstates getting into the three-digit numbers. We had I-105, 17.3 miles from Route 1 to I-605, approved in March 68. We had I-110, 20.5 miles from Route 47 in San Pedro to I-10. Note this only goes to I-10. That was approved in December 1978. So this is the distinction on this one between the Interstate 110 and the State Route 110. And people always get confused as to whether the segment in downtown is actual interstate, and they're even confused on the signage. And I don't think it ever became non-chargeable interstate.
It never did.
Yeah. But people always get that confused and think the segment from 101 to I-10 is Interstate 110. Even though that's called the Harbor Freeway, that is State Route 110. The interstate starts at I-10. And if you think about it, that makes sense. What would the truck route be? They're not going to route folks over Old 101. You had I-205, 13 miles from I-580 to I-5 near Tracy, the Tracy cutoff, in November 1957. You had I-210, 48.6 miles from I-10 near Tunnel Station to I-10, but not I-10 where 210 meets it now. This is I-10 near Pomona, what is now where Route 57 and 10 meets, because that segment of Route 57 is actually Interstate 210 and was built as Interstate 210 from the 10 up to the 210. That was approved in September 1955. And then you had I-280, 57.1 miles from I-680 to 6th Street, Sacramento. This was initially approved in September 1955 from San Jose to San Francisco, but as part of the freeway revolt, in January 1981, the segment in San Francisco from 6th Street to the Oakland Bay Bridge was removed from the system. And this is that whole section that sneaks under the freeway over by, I want to say it's near Candlestick Park, but I'm not an expert on baseball, over near the approach to the bridge to where 480 was.
It's the part that basically empties onto the Embarcadero now. There was never a connection built to I-80 and the Embarcadero Freeway. Continuing on, Interstate 305, 5.3 miles. Interstate 80 west of Sacramento to Route 99. This is signed as US 50. The I-305 designation is not legislatively defined in California, but it is an FHWA designation. This was approved during May 1980. This is former Interstate 80 between Route 99 and Interstate 80. Interstate 380, 3.3 miles from I-280 to San Francisco International Airport. This was approved on December 24th, 1968. Interstate 405, 72.4 miles. I-5, moving back to I-5. This was approved on September 15th, 1955 as El Toro to San Fernando. Interstate 505, 32.9 miles. Interstate 80 near Vacaville to Interstate 5. This was submitted on June 27, 1945.
Continuing on with some more three-digit routes, we had Interstate 580, 68.4 miles from Castro Street in Richmond to I-80 to I-5 near Tracy. And that's actually sort of going in the wrong direction from the post miles, but that's going from west to east. In June 1945, we had the segment from I-80 to I-5 in Oakland to Modesto. This is actually former US 50 right here. We had some adjustments in Oakland in 1955 in September. We had the Tracy adjustment in November 1957. This is when they were finishing up the freeway in that area. And then in April 1978, we had the segment from I-80 in Albany to the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge approved. That was originally I-180 and it was changed to I-580 in 1983. We had I-605, 27.4 miles from the 405 near Seal Beach to to 210. This was approved in two segments. In September 55, you had the 405 to I-10. In 68, you had the segment from the 10 to the 210 added. And then you had I-680, 58 miles, from 280 in San Jose to I-780 in Benicia. In 1955, it was approved from San Jose to Vallejo using what is now I-780. In October 1964, you had some adjustments in San Jose. This is when they were doing some rerouting to move it off of what became 880 onto a new routing. And in July 1973, the former I-680 from Benicia to Vallejo was moved to non-chargeable, and 680 was moved to a new routing.
This brings us to Interstate 780, 6.5 miles, Interstate 80 in Vallejo to Interstate 680 in Benicia. This segment was approved on September 15, 1955 as a portion of Interstate 680 from Benicia to Vallejo. In July 1973, the number was revised. Interstate 805, 28 miles, I-5 looping back to I-5, approved during July 1958, which brings us to Interstate 980 at 0.8 miles, Interstate 80 in Oakland to south of the San Pablo undercrossing. This was approved during January 1976, the 0.8-mile segment between Route 17 / I-880 and 1 mile south of I-880. Segment from 1 mile south of I-880 to I-880 is non-chargeable, so this is an example of a non-chargeable route.
What you've got here is in this one tiny little freeway, you have a portion that is both chargeable, which goes from Route 17 from I-880 to a mile south of 580, and then that last little bit to 580 is actually non-chargeable, just because of how the funding worked out. And now there's a whole movement, especially in the latest federal funding bill, that will look into reconnecting Oakland some way with 980, and that could be removal of 980, that could be bridges across 980, that could be more street crossings across 980. There's just a whole study about that going on right now.
Which is kind of interesting that everyone forgot what happened to the Nimitz Freeway during the Loma Prieta earthquake and how important I-980 was.
Yeah. Now, there are a number of things that once were interstates but were deleted from the system, and many of these were never signed. So you had things like Route 480 in San Francisco, the famous Embarcadero Freeway. That was never signed as an interstate. That was deleted from the interstate system. In 1965, it was signed as State Route 480. The segment of Route 80 west of I-280 was deleted from the interstate system. I think that is now part of US 101 official. If I remember correctly, they did some readjustments.
Part of it is, because I-280 was originally supposed to follow 19th Street to the Golden Gate Bridge, which is part of Highway 1.
Yeah, they sort of get around these. If you're clever, they note they never will sign the interstate or the state shield in the area, but you'll see post miles that just refer to the number. And the number is correct because, of course, that's legislative. You also have the former 105 and 110 in downtown LA. We covered this in our sample episode on 105. The segment from 101 to the 5 was 2B Route 105. And the little segment of 101 from the 5 to the Santa Monica Freeway was to be Interstate 110, and they decided those numbers were meaningless and they wanted the miles elsewhere, so they just kept them as US 101, and that's why those were never signed. There were also some adjustments of Route 280 in San Francisco, as Tom mentioned, in 1965, and in Route 8 east of San Diego in 1965.
Some proposed interstates that were not accepted. So during June 1945, you had Route 4 from Hercules to Concord. So I'm referring to state routes. Route 11 Harbor from Pasadena Freeway. So this is basically from I-10 to 210. Route 13 and Route 24, Emeryville to Walnut Creek. Route 19, Long Beach to Pasadena via what is kind of the corridor of Rosemead Boulevard. Route 37 and US Route 101, San Francisco to Vallejo via Sears Point. US 101, Los Angeles to San Francisco, which that one always surprised me that didn't get approved, but I digress. During August 1956, Route 37 and US 101 again. Route 58, I-5 in Bakersfield to Barstow, so this is part of US 466. This was not approved to be an interstate corridor, so we're kind of getting in one of my favorite interstate topics. Route 86, El Centro to India. This is a former segment of US 99. Continuing on, during May 1958, Route 143 and Route 148 in Sacramento South in East Belt Route. October 1968, Route 30, Interstate 210 to I-15, San Dimas to Etiwanda. This is now California State Route 210. US 50, Sacramento to Nevada. Again, Route 58. This is the last proposal for California State Route 58 between Bakersfield and Barstow to be an interstate. Route 238, Fremont to Hayward, the southern crossing and approaches.
And there are a number of interesting things in these routes. The southern crossing and approaches was approximately where 380 is, if I recall, and it would have gone across to Oakland to meet roughly where 980 is.
Yes. This would have been probably the missing link of 380 that gets talked about a lot in the Bay Area road community.
Okay. You had all the submissions here of Route 58 that Tom mentioned, that there are folks in the road geek community who say, oh, this should be I-40. Hey, folks, they tried. It wasn't justified. Okay. The Route 143 and Route 148, Sacramento South and East Belt route, if you look on my pages where I've got the proposed planning map for Sacramento, you'll see they wanted those additional belt routes. And I think some of these are now coming in. Oh, what's the name of that road that they're building in South Sacramento?
Oh, I can't think of it off the top of my head, but it's a major project right now, too.
Yeah. They're building something along what some of those routes would have been. And I think we had something similar with the routes that were proposed even earlier, especially with Route 37 and Route 4 that were interstate quality. A number of these were addressed through what are called non-chargeable interstates. And the U.S. Code allows for highways to be signed as interstates, designated as interstates, that weren't eligible for interstate completion funds and don't count against the maximum mileage. They needed to be federal aid primary roads that met the criteria for interstates, so they were built to Interstate Highway standards. They were signed to provide continuity and connectivity, and there were two types of these. There was 139A mileage, which was mileage that already met these standards, and 139B mileage was for future interstates. So now we're going to talk about what was submitted and approved for non-chargeable interstates. First, there was I-15. In October 1984, this was approved as future mileage. This is that small segment from I-8 to I-15 that goes through Balboa Park, and I don't think it's been re-signed as Interstate 15, and I think it's got some curves that are still too tight or some bridges that are too low. Do you recall, Tom?
I believe there's a left exit in there somewhere, too, but yeah, it's signed as California State Route 15.
You had Interstate 215, which in 1972, I-15 was shifted to the westerly routing. This is near or along what had been State Route 71. In 1972, the former I-15 between I-10 and Devore became non-chargeable 215. Then it became Interstate 15E. Then it went back to I-215. And in October 1972, it was designated as future I-215 between Temecula and Route 60. December 1973, between I-10 and Route 60 became I-15E, then later I-215. And I remember that segment well because we're members out at what used to be known as Orange Empire Railway Museum in Paris, where you can still ride the old red cars and yellow cars that ran in Los Angeles. And we were going there regularly in the mid-80s to 1990 when they were upgrading 215 to interstate standards. And I always remember it was signed as, I think, temporary Interstate 215 in one direction and 2 I-215 in the other direction. So it was being built in the mid-80s there. Interstate 238 is non-chargeable miles for the 2-mile segment between I-580 and I-880. This happened in May 1983, well before GPS. It was to tell truckers this is interstate mileage. Interstate 580, the constructed portion of Route 17 between Castro Street in Richmond and US 101 via the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge became 180 and then I-580 in July 1983. That is non-chargeable interstate mileage.
Continuing California's non-chargeable interstates, Interstate 680, July 1973, between the I-680 and I-780 split in I-80. I-710, September 1983, Route 7 from Route 1 to Route 10. October 1984, Ocean Boulevard to Route 1. Note that north of I-10 was never approved to be Interstate 710. So even though it's signed as Interstate 710 to Valley, it's not actually an interstate corridor. Status of the portion between Route 47 and Ocean Boulevard is unclear. Interstate 880, May 1983, Route 17 between I-280 and I-80, renumbered as Interstate 880.
And I think there's some interesting things to observe here. On the I-680 portion, we're talking about where you have that 680-780 split. The 680 side of that, north to 80, is non-chargeable interstate. The old chargeable interstate is what became 780. I-710 is interesting on both ends. The whole Pasadena stub area, never Interstate 710. It is legislative Route 710. I don't think you've ever seen a signage of it as interstate. And of course that's changed now with the new legislation that's relinquishing that area. But that's interesting. And then you have the whole other end of it where it went to from Ocean Boulevard to Route 1. And you have that section down near the port between 47 and Ocean Boulevard that, yeah, it's legislative 710, but I don't think it's Interstate 710. And if you've driven that maze of highways, it's really confusing what is what in that area. And the whole segment that goes along, Shoreline Boulevard into the Long Beach area is not part of 710, even though many people think it is.
Well, the guide signs just showed it as I-710, even though it's not, technically.
Yeah. It was built by the city of Long Beach and paid for by the city of Long Beach. And then I still remember when I-80 went from 17 to I-80. I think they were showing that it was really a major route for trucks there because that had been one of the oldest routes. And in fact, I think the segment of that we talked about for 580 that went across the San Rafael Bridge, that was originally also part of Route 7.
Well, that's correct. 17 just in general is one of the oldest major corridors in the Bay Area. The kind of the last vestige of it is what you have south of I-280 to Santa Cruz. Like it just was all gradually built as one continual major north-south route, and a lot of it became I-880.
Continuing on with the non-chargeable interstates, Route 905 in 1984. This was originally Route 117 and Route 125 from I-5 to the border. This is in the process of being constructed. They will probably submit this. This is going to new border crossings, so it does have an interstate purpose. I-980, in 1976, the constructed portion of Route 24 between 580 and 1 mile south of 580 became Interstate 908, and the remaining portion is chargeable mileage, as we mentioned before. Some things that were submitted but never approved: Route 4 between Pinole and West Pittsburgh, Route 113 between Davis and Woodland, so that would parallel 505, and U.S. Route 101, Route 80 in San Francisco. That little segment there, they wanted to submit that as non-chargeable miles. And I think that's why you've got a small segment of stuff that is Route 80, and they never sign it as interstate. They're just post miles, but it's technically state route, not interstate.
And one that kind of doesn't fit any of these is California State Route 210 east of Route 57. That was submitted for non-chargeable mileage, but the application was withdrawn.
Right, which is why they didn't have it in their history. And I don't think they've ever resubmitted it.
They never have.
Again, despite what all the road geeks would want. So let's go to some of the age-old questions related to interstate. First, Tom?
Will it ever fix the abomination that is Interstate 238? When it was created, there was no there was no X80 routes in California available. Now, right now, Route 480 is available, but this isn't a loop route we're talking about. It is a continuation of Route 238. So that's something I don't think a lot of people realize. So Interstate 238 is continuous with California State Route 238. It's not really likely worth the cost of resigning a highway segment just to satisfy grid compliance or interstate numbering conventions. Will they ever extend Interstate 40 to Barstow or the coast? There's no miles left to extend it as chargeable interstates. That's long over. This will require AASHTO approval for non-chargeable miles. The traffic costs might not just justify, well, I'm going to rephrase. I don't think it's worth it, especially with the bypasses you have at Kramer Junction and of Hinckley, which have opened. And it kind of plays into traffic justification west of I-5. There's no way. Route 58 west of I-5 is incredibly rural. It's one of the most fun driving roads you can have out there, and it's totally adequate as a 2-lane road. So that's kind of the thing. Like, I talk about Interstate 40 being extended to Bakersfield all the time in road groups, especially on Facebook, and I don't think people really understand how pretty close to adequate that route really is now with the 2 recent bypasses opening. Really, you could just seal up, I think, 2 at-grade intersections a couple miles east of Bakersfield, and you'd be good for decades.
And you don't really need the interstate number these days with GPS or to tell truckers what is a safe route, whereas you needed it before.
Yeah.
Another question that we always get is, will California 210 ever become Interstate 210? And note that I-210 is chargeable miles. Note that this was submitted at one point and rejected. It would require work on the part of Caltrans to reroute the chargeable section and add the non-chargeable section. It could be done, but it's likely not worth the expense of changing the signage. I mean, your things say take Route 210, but of the various proposals out there, this is the most likely thing to be done. I think of any proposal that we've heard, this one might be done.
This I would say is plausible. I think this is very plausible because I know a lot of those older sign gantries are covering Interstate 210 shields with state highway cover plates.
Are there any other questions you think that people always ask about the interstates in California that we should answer, other than the fact that no, they weren't planned to be landing strips type stuff?
So I think a lot of this is kind of interesting. Most of California's chargeable mileage really did get built. It's really only the really strange stuff like the Golden Gate Freeway, which would have been a monumental project that didn't get built, or like that just the small connection of Interstate 280 to I-80 in downtown San Francisco. As much as people probably now look at it and say, oh, California needs more roads and everything, we really got most of the interstates. So I always thought that perception was kind of strange. Really, the only one that I've seen out there, and I really got to touch on it probably in a blog, there was a push for a while to have Interstate 70 extended through Nevada to Sacramento. And it was mostly Nevada pushing it and not so much California. Personally, I think that proposal's absolutely nuts, especially in Nevada. Maybe not so much in California, especially 50 years ago.
You have what? 2 major mountain ranges to go through, because with where 70 ends into 15 now in Utah, you have a major mountain range, I know, through the center of Nevada. You have it going through the atomic test site.
Mm-hmm.
And then you'd have it going through the Sierra Nevada mountains. So it's just impractical.
Yeah, I mean, like I could see like a need to improve US 50 in the Sierra Nevada mountains in the interest of like safety, but like you're dealing with Echo Summit, it's just I don't see how US 50 realistically could be expanded without tunneling, and that's just a big thing that's always been, because of seismic activity, a big concern. And I know the notion of a freeway in South Lake Tahoe has been something nobody locally really has ever been in favor of in the last couple decades. But when you get into Nevada, like they literally call US 50 east of Fallon the loneliest road in America, even though it's really not. It's very sparsely traveled, especially for a U.S. route. So it definitely does not need to be an interstate corridor.
It would be like making US 6 corridor.
Yeah.
Another age-old question, which is, why did California, if you look at the history, have such odd original numbers for interstates? Tom, do you want to describe that?
Yeah, so what I found researching the AASHTO database was that California in 1958, when the interstate system was brand new and really hadn't gotten going yet, was the Division of Highways really did not want to renumber the U.S. routes. They were really, really against it. So they really tried to get AASHTO to approve renumbering certain interstate corridors not to conflict with existing U.S. routes. So like one that comes to mind right off the top of my head is trying to get Interstate 40 renumbered to Interstate 30. They didn't really seem to be too bothered by renumbering state highways. And they also had some pretty wacky proposals too, which would have had like Interstate 3 on the corridor of what is now Interstate 280. The only state route that never really seemed to want to touch was Route 1. And I think the reason for that is probably pretty obvious, given even in the 1950s that was a big tourism driver. But looking at some of the proposals, like the spur and loop routes, they had some strange numbers like 109, like for kind of like the combined Embarcadero Freeway, Golden Gate Freeway, and what is now Interstate 210. They had some pretty out there concepts too, like having not really following like every north-south route ending in 5 being the major north-south route. So like much of what would be Interstate 5 now would have been Interstate 11.
And we should mention that at times they had a proposal for Interstate 5 West, which later became...
That was actually signed.
Yeah, which later became I-580. And there would have been an I-5 East at that point.
Yeah, that kind of seems like that would have been, my opinion, the perfect I-3 corridor. Kind of having an I-3 loop through Oakland, kind of branching off I-5 and looping back to it.
So you're arguably saying I-580 should have been I-3.
Yeah. Combined with 5505, absolutely. Because you consider where Route 3 ended up, not that I have anything against Wairika, that's a beautiful country up there, but that's just a really weird numbering for that far north in the state.
Yeah, although arguably you might have been able to call that a loop off of 5, except they didn't have any numbers, you know?
Yeah.
Because 405, 605, 805, all taken. So, normally this would be the point where we have an interview, but we're going to be changing things up. It's been getting harder and harder to get commitments for interviews and harder to get them scheduled at the appropriate times to work into the right podcast episodes. So we'll still work on getting interviews, but we're going to publish them as bonus episodes, except in some special cases when we're going route by route. And there's something particularly enlightening we can arrange. And an example of that, when we do Route 1 in Los Angeles County next season, I really want to try and get the fellow behind the Hidden History of Los Angeles podcast to talk about May Ringe, who is the landowner who basically prevented the state from building the Coast Highway through Malibu. She posted armed guards. She did whatever she could to make it so they could not build through Malibu. And I'm almost of the contention that's why we had Decker Canyon, because that was the furthest that they could get the coast route up and then have folks go across to avoid her ranch. So I really want to try and get that interview. But except for those special cases, we're going to try and publish things as bonus episodes.
Next on the California Highways Route by Route, we'll finish looking at the numbering with exploration of the county signed route system. We'll look at history, allocations of routes, and status today. Varied.
Yeah, it should be interesting. There are counties that do a really good job of signage and making the routes useful. I was down in San Diego recently, and they do a wonderful job. Tom knows some of the counties up near where he is that do great jobs. And then there are counties that either don't have any signed routes, or they no longer use this system. They use their own system, or they've totally forgotten about the system. LA County is an example of that. I tried to get someone from LA County for an interview, and no one there knows about the system, and the state doesn't know about the system. So it should be an interesting episode for those who are into the county signed route. For more information, visit the highway numbering section over on CAHighways.org. We also have a number of Gribble Nation blogs on the subject, and we will have specific links on the show page. Links to relevant information, as we pointed out, some of the source material for this will be out on CARoutebyroute.org. And details for specific routes can be found on the specific route pages on CAHighways.org and GribbleNation.org. And if I don't link to them, all the pages on Gribble Nation, well, if you look on the page on CA Highways, I have all the links to the Gribble Nation pages down in the link section. So we will get you there.
As always, information on this episode is available on our website, caroutebyroute.org, where you can also leave us a comment on this episode. This episode is available on our anchor.fm home, anchor.fm/CA Route by Route. This will soon become Spotify by podcasters. We will update the URL in our next episode. Remember to visit the archives of past episodes, including our 6-part series in the history of the state highway system. Join us as we continue to explore California highways route by route.
This episode was written by Daniel Fagan and Tom Fear, edited and produced by Daniel Fagan. Our opening theme is I'd Like to Be by the Seaside by John H. Slover-Kine. If you have an opening theme you think might be good for our show, and is either in the public domain or you're willing to let us use for free, contact me at daniel@caroutebyroute.org. Episodes are recorded using freeconferencecall.com. This podcast is a product of California Highways at cahighways.org and Gribble Nation at gribblnation.org. And as I always like to close the episode, Tom, do you have any closing thoughts on interstate highways in California?
I really think that kind of more than most states, the interstate system in California is kind of like one of the signature elements that's kind of part of the state identity. So a lot of the major interstates are kind of synonymous with metro areas and are some of the most easily identifiable facets of what people would probably associate what is California. This is kind of like when you get into names of freeways, like I know in Southern California, they phrase everything as like the 5 or the 410, especially Interstate 405. You really can figure out where you're at pretty quick because I think in popular culture, people probably associate interstate highways more of California than they would probably with any other state.
I think it's interesting to note with respect to the interstates in California that many of them were just upgrades of routes that were already planned or under construction. Certainly things like I-10, I-15, these were in many ways existing routes that were just upgraded. I even think you had lots of I-80 that had been being upgraded as freeway even before the interstate. Other routes were pretty much newly built as interstates. The 405 is a great example of that. I want to say some of 605 was built that way, certainly newer ones like 105. And I think it helped change the state and it helped grow the state. I think the interstate system had a large impact on that and where people were housed. And with that, we will see you on our next episode when we will talk about the county signed route system in California.